working? Yes. Okay. So hello everyone, sorry for the delay. We hope you had all a pleasant stay. Me, Elias Kyewski, and my colleague Nicolas Martin from the IC Fraunhofer Institute are very happy to welcome you on this panel on microtargeting, computational propaganda, privacy and democracy. And this panel aims to advance the debate on this phenomenon, risks, potential benefits, but also necessary regulatory processes and regulatory laws, maybe. And we are very happy to introduce to you our panelists. And we have 5 wonderful panelists over here. And at first, I want to start with Sanne Kruikemeier. She's an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam, Faculty of Social and Behavior Science. And she's our expert in the communication and journalism studies. So further, we have Vidya Narayanan. She's a postdoctoral researcher in the computational propaganda project at the Oxford Internet Institute. Further, we have Christina Irion. She stepped in for Frederik Zuiderveen Borgesius, who can't be here, so thank you very much for stepping in this spontaneously. And she's a senior researcher at the University for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam and a postdoctoral researcher to the project Personalized Communication. Further, we have Olivier Micol. He's the Directorate General for Justice and Consumers of the European Commission. Thank you for being our panelist today. And last but not least, we have Aikaterini Pouliou. She's the legal officer at EDPS, so the European Data Protection Supervisor. So thank you all for being our panelists. And we might start with the questions, and we have several question and answer rounds. So we will let you know when you can ask questions to the panelists. So this is not like a presentation style panel, but more a roundtable discussion. So we will ask questions to our panelists, and you have the opportunity to step in and ask questions to the panelists. So maybe we start with the first question, and maybe Vidya, can you give us a brief description on what political microtargeting is?
So what is political microtargeting? So now we have social media, and we have a number of people who participate in political processes through the medium of Facebook or Twitter. Sorry, and everybody seems to have a megaphone these days and fancies themselves as a political commentator. This also provides affordances for certain actors, political actors, as well as certain companies who can use this data to map your preferences and perhaps send targeted political messages. So depending on perhaps your age or gender or your geographical location, these things that you advertise when you open a Facebook account or when you search for something on Google. So they use this data, and there are as you know, advanced machine learning techniques that can work on these data sets to predict what you might like, what your political preferences might be, and so on. And they're able, in some cases, to work with political parties and campaigners in order to suggest that a certain line, a certain agenda, or a certain topic might appeal to you, and they're able to send targeted messages. So this, in a sense, is political targeting. I would say the use of big data combined with advanced machine learning techniques to customize political messages to specific audience groups.
And maybe an additional question, so what additional tools and practices besides micro-targeting add to computational propaganda, and how do the two relate together?
Right, so in the computational propaganda, we track what is known as junk news. So we have consciously moved away from using the term fake news because it's become politicized. It's used by people in power to attack organizations that might be critical of their policies and so on. So we have moved away from the term fake news and used this term called junk news. So junk news could be sensational reporting, it could be hyper-partisan biased reporting, it could be news that is peddled by organizations that don't have proper fact-checking or that are not open about their editorial team and policies. And they present news that is designed to press your emotional hot buttons, so to speak. So we track elections across a number of countries and extract these news sources from tweets and public Facebook posts, from public pages, of course, and classify these news sources according to certain criteria, whether they're professional content, whether they're professional political content, or they are polarizing content. I mean, that's designed, that is used strategically. So this kind of news is used strategically to influence, to manipulate voter groups. So this is a significant part of our work, and there are also automated accounts, bots, in other words, that can amplify these sources of news and create a false impression that there is a broad consensus around certain issues. And the same techniques can also be used to suppress other opinions or other viewpoints and to attack voices that are perhaps critical of certain opinions. So this is the other aspect of our work.
If I can come in there perhaps with a couple of questions on that note. Perhaps the first one, if you could tell us a little bit more about how techniques of micro-targeting, so sort of individually optimized electoral or political adverts, and these other forms of propaganda, which are more focused maybe on disinformation, how do they relate to each other? I mean, do actors kind of commonly use these techniques together, or is actually little systematic or logical relation between them? You may do one, you may do the other, but not necessarily both at all.
Right. So in our work, we focused more on detecting the spread of junk news on social media and not so much on what is commonly recognized as political micro-targeting. So I think political targeting has received a lot of attention because of the infamous Cambridge Analytica scandal and so on. So we don't have the data to be able to convincingly say that these targets, these techniques are used always together, or they're part of a broad strategy. It could be that there are actors who peddle fake news, who peddle junk news, and try to deepen existing fault lines in society. At the same time, they work in conjunction with other algorithms that are able to push certain types of content, polarizing content, to certain to particular groups in order to maximize their spread and their effect.
Thanks. Maybe another question both to you and to our more loyally inclined colleagues. Is micro-targeting especially, per definition, fully automated? Or do you end up seeing also fully automated from a regulatory perspective? Or do you end up seeing a lot of kind of partially human-curated, partially automated activity?
So I would say that it has elements of both sort of human curation, working together with algorithms to perfect this sort of technique. So it would use, humans' traditional campaign techniques combined with these advanced data analysis, analytic techniques in order to deliver maximum benefit for their clients or customers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from a legal and regulatory point of view, we have points of interventions, of course, where political actors or any other economic actor is trying to make a contract for placing ads, especially when there is a financial, if money is involved, if you pay for this kind of targeting, if you pay for the service to amplify the message, for example, on social networks. And this is also where at the moment most regulatory thinking goes to start having here certain safeguards established.
Thanks.
So you talked a lot about what microtargeting is and what are the law constructs and regulatory processes, but what are the effects and risks? So maybe we can jump to Sanne and just give her. What do you think? What are the effects and risks of microtargeting, and is microtargeting able to influence swaying voters or political party interests?
So yes, if we talk about effects, it's always important to first establish effects on what. So with a few colleagues, we wrote an article, and hopefully this works. But
Just a green button.
yeah, so you want to try? Yeah. We wrote an article in which we map out the different effects on people, on the population in general, like a larger part of society, and also for political parties. Using this, I hope this will work, we discussed some of these more promises and also more threats. So with regard to promises, you see that, for instance, for citizens, microtargeting can also have more beneficial effects, right? It can lead to more relevant advertising, more relevant information, for instance. But also you can read social groups, which are difficult to grasp otherwise if you would pay for advertising on television, for instance. On the other hand, such intended consequences can also have unintended consequences. For instance, because you target specific groups, you can also exclude specific social groups. On the other hand, you can also manipulate voters, and also you can invade privacy. So on the citizen side, there are some intended consequences, but it can also lead to unintended consequences, which might also be more negative. We'll see for political parties, it's very cheap, for instance, to use this kind of advertising on the one hand, although if you want to target larger populations, it's also more difficult, it can be more expensive in that sense. And we see also that it leads to more, and I think this one is very important, also to a lot of power to these intermediaries, these Google, for instance, or Facebook. They have a lot of power because they hold all the information. In the Netherlands, for instance, a lot of voters are protected due to different laws, but I think Christina can also say something about that. But that means that a lot of political parties don't have also the resources and the information to get a lot of information about people, and they use these big intermediaries to get this kind of data. And also the lack of transparency on what politicians are sending out for information. If you have information on a website which is easily accessible, everybody can check it, also journalists, for instance. But if you send all these different messages to different voters, then it might also be difficult to control. So there are, and I think this is what we outline in the article, and I wrote down the link if you are interested in the specific promises and threats. But I think the general idea is that if we talk about what the effects are, we also have to think about the different forms of effects. If you talk about what do we know about the effects, we know very little still. There is some evidence suggesting that effects might be small, because that's also because in media research we often found that effects can be, for instance, positive or negative, but they are often small in size. So there is also some evidence, for instance, you even can mobilize voters, but we still know little about whether you can actually manipulate voters and have a big impact during elections. So we're a little bit in the dark in that sense. Yeah.
And from the side of like the consumer of micro-targeting news or ads, is it possible for me to see, oh, this is a micro-targeting advertisement or something like that?
I think, yes, you can see that. I think there are some ways which Facebook, for instance, discloses some information and you can check, but I still believe that the information is very vague and it's very difficult to check whether, because, for instance, you get an ad on your Facebook wall and then you can check using this arrow to see what kind of information they target. And they say, well, because you're a woman, you're between 30 and 50, and now you know my age, so it's still very vague. And I think they are more specific, targeted in a more specific way, but it's very difficult as a consumer to check that. And also, it also asks a lot from consumers, I would say. More people who are used of seeing these kinds of ads, have more media literacy in that sense, are more able to see this, yeah.
Just a follow-up question on that. It occurs to me, I mean, here within sort of CPDP circles, everybody knows probably about micro-targeting, who has an idea that the ads they are served may not be random, may be related to them. Do we know anything about sort of the average user in front of their computer? How aware are they of micro-targeting, or how aware are they that that there are very specific reasons why they are seeing that ad?
I think if we look at how much people know about privacy, I think a lot of people know actually something, but not specifically how it works. They don't know that if the websites they visit, that they're all kind of cookies are tracking, and ad companies are tracking your information. I think people are not very aware of that actually, but I think they know something. And I think what we see also in research, that there's a group, of course, a group who is very aware, and they feel a lot of risk, and they don't trust online companies. But there's also a group who says it's on the average side, where they have a moderately amount of privacy concerns, a moderately amount of trust. They feel some risk, but the thing is they really don't have an alternative. They continue to use because they feel, now I need this website now, I want to use Facebook, and they don't feel that there is big risk at the moment. So that's what we find in research in general.
Maybe returning to the question of how strong the effects of this stuff are, do we know very much about what role the kind of the larger offline context plays in shaping what the effects of micro-targeting and maybe also more broadly disinformation and disinformation campaigns are? And by offline context, I'm thinking now in particular of things like the behavior of established offline media or political actors or opinion formers. Do we know anything about that?
What we know from research is that this idea, right, that people live in filter bubbles and that they only see their Facebook wall, and I think this is not really happening. I think people are not living in a vacuum. They see, talk to other friends, and media play a big role still in a lot of people's lives. And then I mean with traditional media. We see a big divide in age. So youngsters are more seeing social media, online media as their main source of information. But we see that older generations are still using mainly television and newspapers. So what we see, especially for instance in the Netherlands, we see that traditional media play an important role. For instance, the 8 o'clock news is watched by 2 million people, 1 to 2 million people each day. So they play a big role in setting the agenda, giving information. So I think what's very important, if you talk about the effects of micro-targeting, especially online micro-targeting, you always have to see the bigger picture and see that people use different ways to inform themselves, and we still see that. However, I think because you see a shift in age, that especially younger generations are, for instance, watching less television and only using their mobile phones, for instance, to access news and information, then it becomes more important. And not only targeting on, for instance, on social media, but also the way they use apps and what algorithms play and how they personalize their news feeds, for instance. So there are bigger forces there. So I think it's something we should very focus on, especially because it's very popular among younger generations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we have time for some questions from the audience. So one question.
Perhaps just to clarify, so we'll take maybe let's say 4 questions now, and we'd ask you, and then later we'll have a further question and answer. So I'd ask you to focus questions you have now specifically on the issues we've talked about so far, sort of so effects of it, what this stuff is about. Regulatory issues in particular, we'll speak about then next. So I'd ask you to hold any questions you have about regulatory matters for the next session, for the next moment. Mm-hmm.
Good evening.
And we'll take several in a row and then answer.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your first discussions or clarifying the words. I wanted to ask you which of these phenomena, microtargeting, computational propaganda, you expect now in the upcoming EU elections. What are you seeing already? Are there from the propaganda of the right-wing parties or the populists? Is there something going on? What do you expect? Is there a real threat we have to have in mind? What will happen maybe?
The gentleman here in blue.
My name is Nico van Nieuwenhuizen. I work for the Flemish Parliament here in Brussels. My question is mostly directed at Sanne Kruikemeier. One of the people missing at the table is people representing political parties. So I'm here to defend their purpose. I was last year here as well. It was also about microtargeting, but mostly about products. I noticed that at the last table that Ms. Kruikemeier showed that it was, sorry, I'm taking my notes, that it was invading privacy. My comment on that is that, as far as I know, Facebook doesn't give private data to political parties. They have to go through Facebook themselves. So that's questionable. But also mainly manipulating voters. Isn't that what a political party is supposed to do? Offline as well. So what's the harm? What's the threat? I want to understand.
Any two further questions? Maybe the lady here, well, the gentleman, and then we'll give those both two ladies, and then we'll have 5 questions.
Okay, thank you. Andrew Adams from Major University. Could you speak a little bit about the feedback loops element that comes into this? Your presentation initially on what, in particular, microtargeting is was very good, but you missed out this latter step of them being able to figure out what works and what doesn't, and tracking. And I think this happens in the junk news area as well a bit, that there seems to be some work on that. I wonder if you could expand a bit on that.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question for you, Vidya, because I wanted to know more about the, I would say, impact of behavioral sciences in the development of these junk news. As you said, they were designed to use our emotional, leverages to expand. And I wanted to know how sophisticated, I would say, the interaction between behavioral sciences, big data, etc., now is evolving.
Hello. First of all, I wanted to actually make a comment related to one of the previous questions of the gentleman here in front of me, because I think that one of the issues is that a lot of people are not yet aware that there are official documents actually stating that political microtargeting is a threat to democracy. And both the ICO guidance and the European Data Protection Supervisor have been very vocal on this, so I'm not sure whether this is an appropriate point for this panel right now. But my question is, do you feel the need for a more general regulation at EU level for this issue? Because the only two line of defenses that we have right now, one of them is data protection, where let's say we have GDPR, but enforced still kind of locally, which is a problem in itself. And the second one is that electoral laws are by definition national. ICO has started to investigate and fine both Cambridge Analytica and Aggregate IQ, at least those two, for infringing the UK electoral laws. However, the electoral laws vary from one country to the other. So what do we do then? One of the issues that I have noticed and that I feel personally as a threat is that we, as social media users, each of us, we don't know what the others see. I see one thing, and I might be discussing with you about a certain political party and about a certain message, but you have seen something else. And I don't know what you've seen, and you don't know what I've seen. How do we tackle this? Do we make kind of a centralized register like we have for medicine? Or, I don't know, should we do something about that? Thank you.
Forgive me for intervening. I mean, I think we'll maybe address that afterwards when we come to the regulatory issues. But we'll make a note of those points. So with that, I'll hand over to panelists.
Sure. So I think the first question was about the likely role of misinformation, disinformation in the upcoming EU elections. So we've just started, we're in the process of getting a team together to study the EU elections, but we have studied elections, a number of elections in Europe, and the most recent elections that we studied was the parliamentary elections in Sweden. And we did find that there was a lot of junk news. There was so for every 3 URLs, every 3 links to news sources that was being shared on Twitter, one of them was a junk news source, was a link to a junk news source. And we also determined that most of this junk news was homegrown. In other words, it's not a foreign power, or we didn't find any evidence of foreign interference in the Swedish elections, but the sort of polarizing content was homegrown. And in our previous studies in France, in Germany, and in the UK, we have found that, so for instance, in Germany, we found that for every 4 links to professional news sources, there was 1 link to a junk news source. The numbers are similar in the UK, whereas in France, the situation is slightly better. It was 1 link to a junk news source to around 11 sources, 11 links to professionally sourced news, professional news sources. So based on our previous studies, I think it's highly likely that we would see a lot of polarizing content, hyperpartisan content, content that seeks to deepen fault lines and that seeks to push certain specific agendas in the forthcoming EU elections. Yeah.
It's, related to that a little bit, so I think micro-targeting is very big online now, especially on Facebook, a little bit on Instagram. And if you talk about computational propaganda, I always think about bots in that sense. Hopefully the slides work again. So I included a slide from some research from the TU Delft. They are computational scientists. They checked how many bots there were for each political party in the Netherlands, how many followers, for instance. And it's quite low. It ranges between 2 to 10% of the amount of followers, for instance. So you see that there are bots present. However, they are there's more people just still communicating, for instance, with political parties or politicians. So in that sense, because the estimates of having bots online, the presence of the amount of bots, for instance, is around 60%. However, for political parties, the numbers were quite small. And the other question from the politician, and I think it's very important to include that perspective as well, but I think you mentioned, but political parties always want to manipulate voters, right? That's what they do. Well, I think what's very important, also alludes a little bit to what was mentioned later on, is that we also have these dark posts, right? So these posts who are presented to some people but aren't to others. And I think what is very important about these posts is that also can suppress voting, right? So if they send a certain message, and what's happening in the US, to certain voters, then you can also suppress voting. And that's something I think no political party wants to happen. In that sense, I think manipulating can be a really negative consequence, or have a big impact on democracy. So in that sense, I think that's and that's not okay. But I think what the problem with the word manipulating is always is that it also relates a little bit to persuading voters, right? But I think the downside or the big threat of this manipulation can be that people don't go out to vote, and I think this is something we all don't want to happen.
Yeah, and I think there was another question about the impact of these influence campaigns and how they intersect with our own inclinations as human beings to share this kind of conspiratorial content. So I think that is an important link that we are still investigating. So we haven't identified the causal factors that make certain groups more vulnerable to this kind of dubious content than other populations or other groups. I mean, it could be a combination of various factors. It could be your media literacy. It could be your political inclination. It could be how confident you are as a person, and how many, what has been the environment in which your political identity was shaped. So there are a number of factors that I think contribute to the spread of polarizing junk content, and the links are not yet clear, but that's something that we are interested in investigating.
Then, unless one of our panelists still wants to address one of the questions. Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think we have to be a bit more nuanced because we are tackling two different topics here. One is computational propaganda and junk news, and the other one is political microtargeting. And when we are throwing this all together, then there can be quickly the impression that this is all toxic in itself. And I want to correct that a little bit. There is, of course, something really toxic about computational propaganda and this junk content. Political microtargeting can be both beneficial and it can have some dark sides, and I think Sanne has provided really nice examples like discouraging people, or also giving different micro messages to different voters so that they actually are not able to see what the others see. Such things are a problem, but in principle it's also a new technique of political communication that we should not throw out with the bathwater right away, yeah?
But then let me press you on, and maybe the other panelists as well, a bit on this point, because while I could see there may be in principle some benefits that micro-targeting might deliver, like say somewhat more targeted information relating to your particular political concerns. I'm very concerned about the environment. It might be nice to know more about the environmental position of this particular party or that particular party in the political advertisements I see. Or it might slightly increase my general level of political engagement. So those could be two benefits that I could offhand imagine. My question is, well, I mean, one, maybe are there others still that I'm not seeing, but especially, are these benefits from micro-targeting so substantial that it is kind of worth tolerating the bathwater, or tolerating some of the bathwater, if we can't get rid of it all? Can't we get these benefits also through other things?
I think in general, I think it's very great that you can, what the problem is, I think, with advertising on television, it's you don't know who you are reaching, right? And I think this is a great benefit of having social media. Especially youngsters are difficult to reach. If you can match their advertising on their platforms, you can engage them. And I think especially for youngsters who are in a crucial age, they're going to vote for the first time, to reach such a group and with in their own environment, which they use in their daily lives on a daily basis. That is, I think, really a great opportunity as well. So I think in that sense, it's still very important. We should take these benefits into account. I think it's always important to, if there is a lot of suppression of going to out of vote, if you can, then of course you need to regulate that, I think. So, but I think the opportunities that it also brings to target specific groups that are difficult to reach otherwise, I think this is a great opportunity.
Okay, then let's maybe then at this note turn more to some of the regulatory issues. So the first question to all three from the more legal and regulatory side is what can data protection law actually do to address these risks? What sort of conceptual or legal resources does it offer, or does it not offer? What else may we still need?
Maybe I reply. I start with the first shot on this one, and it was already mentioned by one of the person in the room that indeed one tool we have at our disposal to deal with micro-targeting is, of course, data protection rules that we have at EU level, and in the first place, the General Data Protection Regulation, which entered into application last May. But then, in this context, we have to define more precisely which aspects of micro-targeting we are talking about. Because, as was said already a number of times, the political parties are normally addressing their potential voters in their field of interest. And this is perfectly legitimate. If I know that you like cycling, I will target my message to you. I will, and this is a basic of politics. What we have seen, thanks to the very good work of the UK data protection authorities in investigating the famous Cambridge Analytica case, is that here the problem is due to the fact that personal data were unlawfully used to achieve this micro-targeting. And this is where the legislation can come in. And indeed, in this overall approach, you have a lot of actors. It's not only the political parties, these are the data brokers, these are the data analysts, there are the social media platforms. They all play different roles, and I strongly encourage you, if you have not done it, to read this very substantial analysis done by the UK ICO, because then you see the different roles, and then you can tackle this issue, because in this specific case, even when you do profiling, and when you do micro-targeting, and then we have to define exactly what it is, you have to comply with all GDPR rules. And one of the first rules is that you need a lawful ground for processing personal data. And then many of the actors involved there had no lawful ground to process this personal data. They didn't comply with the transparency requirement, and this was one of the questions that was addressed. Of course, as a political party, I can talk, and I should target, I should tailor my message. But I need also, when I use personal data, I have to be transparent. I'm using your data for that purpose. I'm telling you that I am using this data, and by the way, I'm not transferring your data to somebody else for another purpose, because this is not legal. So all that, as long as it is framed in this framework, this is perfectly fine. But as we saw with a lot of practice, not only in the EU, this micro-targeting is not transparent, might indeed push people to vote or not to vote. And then you have also another dimension of the General Data Protection Regulation, which is very relevant, that you should not, as a data subject, as a citizens, be subject to this automated decision-making, having a legal effect or a substantially equivalent legal effect on you. What does it mean in practice? This is a wording of the GDPR. I realize it's not fully clear, but you cannot be subject to an automated decision-making was a big impact on you. This is what it means in proper term. Then the question, and this will have to be assessed on a case-by-case basis by the data protection authorities, and this is what the ICO has done, what other data protection authority in the EU will do, is that if this micro-targeting is indeed an automated decision-making, which is normally the case, does it have on you a big impact, a significant impact? And if it has such an impact, it's authorized under EU law only if you have given your explicit consent or if you have a legislation which authorizes the political party, for instance, to do so. And the question, it really will be this case-by-case assessment. Does this micro-targeting, when it exploits potential weaknesses of voters, when it exploits, let's say, yes, I mean, state of mind of voters, etc., shall it be considered as an automated decision-making leading to a substantial impact on you? And there you have, indeed, this conclusion in the UK ICO report. They say that indeed, in several instances, it could lead to fall under this prohibition of an automated decision-making, leading to a big impact. In our communication, because as a commission, we issued guidance on how to use personal data in electoral context, we point to the fact that the data protection authorities, for instance, say that when you do this targeting advertising, normally it's not prohibited, but you can have instances where it could be falling under this prohibition, depending on assessing the weakness of the people who receive it or not. So this is really this issue from a purely data protection point of view that the enforcers on the ground, so the data protection authorities, will have to assess. And again, in the case of Cambridge Analytica, then the purely data protection aspect was clearly proven to be unlawful. So this is, I would say, a first reply.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. If I may build on that, and thank you, Mr. Micol. So data protection law is important because it does address, it regulates the issue of online political microtargeting. But what is also another point I'd like to make here is the enforcement of data protection law. And I think ICO's investigation is of course, it's ongoing, but it's still, I think, and we don't know what the outcome will be, but I think it's going towards the right direction. Because but that was one point, the enforcement of data protection. But I'd like also to build a bit on that, because data protection is by definition limited to that, when we've already seen that there are other fundamental rights that are being affected by these practices, such as the right to privacy, to political privacy in this context, which has to do with the right to vote and to hold political discussions, the right to have fair, free, and transparent elections, the freedom to information and to expressions. So we've research so far suggests that these practices affect civic engagement in decision making, as well as the involvement of the public in the democratic processes in general. So we do see that this is an issue that also, apart from a data protection dimension, it also has ethical and societal dimensions. And that's where I'd like to come to my third point. Although at EDPS we do believe it is important to enforce data protection regulation, we do think that, we do strongly believe that it's only one single arm of regulation which cannot tackle all the issues that arise from these practices. So in this context, electoral law, competition law, consumer law, privacy regulation, and even ethics discussions are equally important. And especially in 2019, which is the year of the EP elections and another number of other national elections, it's regulators that should join forces to ensure fair and free participation in the elections. And the EDPS has actually discussed all those issues in the online manipulation that we issued last year in March. And we actually also come with a number of recommendations that to address the complex issues, we believe, that arise from these practices. So if you want more information on that, you can find it online. But I think that we should all be, all these discussions, all these points should be in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe to follow on 2 points of that briefly, I wanted to go back to what Olivier Micol was saying about whether or not micro-targeting would be considered automated processing with legal or similar effects. And as far as I understood, what you were saying was it might be, it might not be. So there could be context where there is political micro-targeting for political electoral purposes, which would not be considered to have electoral, to have legal or similar effects in your view. Is that correct? You would not want to make a blanket statement,
No.
all political targeting is...
No, indeed. There will be an assessment, and depending on factors like for instance, exploiting weaknesses of the target, which will have to be done. But in any case, even if you do, let's say, targeting of a certain voters, you have to comply in any case with all the corpus of the General Data Protection Regulation. That is to say, you have to be transparent. You have to find a legal base for such processing. So in the case of Cambridge Analytica, for instance, there were some people who had given their data, given their consent. There were all their friends on Facebook who had not given their consent for the processing of their data. So this, you can see already you stop because you don't have a legal base. And then even if you had a legal base, then you would need to inform the people. And they could withdraw their consent. Or if you have another legal base, you have, if it is a legitimate interest, you could also withdraw, you could object. Then the question is, what type of data you're processing? Is it data relating to your political opinion or your sexual life, etc.? Then this is sensitive data. Then under the General Data Protection Regulation, to process this data, you have very strict standards to meet. So indeed, I'm not saying that data protection could solve everything, but it could address a number of big issues. And I would like also to agree with what you just said, that what is important in view of the European election is that the various regulators at national level, so the Electoral Committee, the data protection authorities, the authority in charge of cyber securities, etc., are working together. And this is why, as a Commission, we have established these networks of what we call electoral networks, where at national level, these authorities should speak together and should report at EU level about what they see as danger. It might be cybersecurity, it might be disinformation, it might be data protection issues, and indeed all these issues are intricate and they have to be tackled in, let's say, in an horizontal way. This is what we try to describe in our so-called electoral package in September, with all these different elements, and where really we have we can induce this discussion at national level, because a lot of this work will have to be done at national levels between the various regulators. And if I may end, at EU level, because this is where we have the competence, we have just now, we had proposed, and there has been a political agreement on the fact that for EU political parties and foundation, in case there has been, that the data protection authorities have found that such a party or foundation at EU level have breached data protection rules, and then the European authorities over political parties and foundation determined that this breach of data protection rule has been done in order to influence election, then not only will this political party and foundation be subject to the fines that they can receive from the data protection authority under GDPR, but on top of that, they will be financially punished for the attempt to influence the election. And then the next year, they cannot apply to receive funding at EU level. And when you know that most of the funding of political parties at EU level and foundation comes from the EU budget, it is a very big deterrent at EU level not to start, let's say, breaching data protection rules in order to influence election.
Time is moving on, so I'll ask a last question, and then we can have some more questions from the audience, I hope. But just on this last point, to both our regulators and all other panelists, I mean, how confident do you think can we actually be that breaches or misbehavior would be discovered and sanctioned in a timely manner, remembering how short actually periods are before an election takes place.
So I will address this issue on an EU level, but also on a member state level. And I'd like to start by saying that data protection authorities around the world had already acknowledged the risks of processing of personal data for political purposes back in 2005 in their joint resolution, which shows that DPAs have been aware of this issue for quite some time now. And on a member state level, we already mentioned the ICO's investigation, which is a bright example of the work of a national DPA towards the right direction. But there are also a number of other national authorities, data protection authorities, that have developed rules or guidelines on data processing for political purposes, such as the Italian and the French DPA. So enforcement of data protection law is clearly an important factor in, let's say, remedying the situation. And I think it should be, if it's not already, a strategic priority for all of them at the moment. Now, on an EU level, the EDPS is also a data protection authority, but for the EU institutions. And we are competent to supervise the EP elections, the European Parliament, the European political groups, and we are closely monitoring the EP elections. And so in that context, we advise the EU institutions on legislative measures, and that's what we did with the Commission's electoral package with our opinion. We also encourage cooperation, as I mentioned earlier, but not only between DPAs, but also between other regulatory authorities. And so in this context, we also have launched our Digital Clearing House initiative back in 2017, which is actually a forum that cooperates dialogue between them. And in the last meeting at the end of 2018, electoral regulators also participated. And we, as a supervisor, one of our roles is to promote public awareness. So in this context, we're also organizing a workshop on the 11th of February on the upcoming elections, and it's open to the public. And there, DPAs, electoral regulators, audiovisual regulators, media, and platforms will gather to address the issue of online manipulation in elections and try to come up with steps to collectively address these issues. So to answer your question, we're confident that with all these steps, with cooperation between the authorities and public awareness, any abuses, if any, will be uncovered and data protection law will be enforced.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah. I also want to chime in and think while data protection law can play a really an important role to ensure some of the protections for voters, especially in their privacy, and also avoid aspects of digital manipulation. This is, of course, the objective of data protection law is not to ensure free and fair democratic elections, right? So we have to see that there is a much more complicated division of labor between different regulations. Already mentioned was electoral laws at the member states, but also not yet mentioned media laws. In fact, a lot of member states regulate really into some detail television advertisement during election campaigns for political parties and who gets how many minutes. And there is really like a rather complex system in place. So if we have to now broaden our view to social media, for example, then I don't see a reason why there shouldn't be also some rules and safeguards in place, especially if you consider that political microtargeting is always involving some sort of financial remuneration. It's actually a perfect business model because the social network is always earning from every political actor money for targeting messages to the same electorate. It's wonderful, it's like printing money. But then you would also say there is a way of regulating it. There are, at the moment, for example, the transparency that we have more transparency on Facebook is a voluntary commitment by the network. I don't see a reason why that shouldn't be also in the laws. We need the transparency because only with such elementary transparency of who is ordering which type of micro messages to be targeted at what type of population. We cannot actually see what is going on, and we are not able to also verify if that has always been in line with fairness principles and election laws and so on and so on. So there needs to be a bit of upgrading, a bit of maintenance work at the member states level as well, in their electoral laws, but also in their media laws. And yes, platforms that are offering as a service the amplification of political messages and get money for it, they should also have obligations attached to that.
Okay, then let's take 3 questions now, and then another 3 after that. So let's take the lady over here first.
Hi, Judith Meller, also University of Amsterdam. I wanted to respond to data protection as a solution to this problem, and also to the speaker earlier who said that it wasn't the political parties who process the data, it's Facebook, which is actually true. But I invite you all to also stay for the panel that starts at 4 o'clock, in which one of the speakers is called Daniel Kreis, and he published a very interesting study last year together with Shannon McGregor, in which he showed how embedded the political campaigns were in Facebook. So they were working very, very closely together to get optimal micro-targeting. And the downside of this is that Facebook has complete legal grounds to do this. So all these tools that you described, and it would have been wonderful, sort of circumvented this way. And to add insult to injury, Facebook also just this week decided to stop ProPublica from observing how much targeting is going on Facebook, and this will now only be done internally through Facebook, which is a very commendable effort, but then we have to place all our trust in Facebook that they are doing this the right way, and I don't think we should.
And let's take the gentleman, yeah.
Tobias Bonschutz from Datenschutzraum Germany. My question is, we see a lot of data breaches and so on, so is that a problem that data from data breaches can be used for micro-targeting, and is not the collection of the data itself part of the problem, and would be better to enforce data minimization in that topic?
And the third question? No third question apparently, so let's take responses to these first 2 if we want.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe I start. On the first question, and it's maybe in a way linked to the second one. First of all, I never said that data protection should be a solution of everything. I exactly said the contrary. It's one element. You have cybersecurity, disinformation, etc. And in this electoral package, we are tackling all these issues. Data protection is one element among others. But then who is processing the data? This is a point I tried to make earlier. It's not, it's a data. What Facebook offers is in fact a profiling. It's then the data, they are processed lawfully or unlawfully by plenty of different actors. At the end of the day, it's a political party who will make use of it. But as a political party, I have to be sure that the data which is given to me maybe by a data broker, by a data analyst, and so on, have been processed lawfully in a transparent way, complying with all the GDPR requirements. And this is precisely what was not the case in the Cambridge Analytica case and similar cases. So here, the data have been, in the Cambridge Analytica case, processed by Cambridge Analytica, shared unlawfully, etc. So indeed, what is very important is not to focus only on the social media, but to have all this chain of actors. And sometimes it can be very complicated. The second question was about breaches. Can this data resulting from breaches be used to target? When we talk about breaches under the GDPR, is data which has been hacked or data which you have by negligence, let's say, has been spread out. In the Cambridge Analytica case, for instance, it was not the case. The data has not been hacked. There has been no breach into Facebook database or etc. It's simply that these data have been unlawfully transmitted to people who should not have received it, that they have been even collected unlawfully, etc. So I think this danger is much bigger in a way than, you know, to hack a big database, to attack the cybersecurity of one database, to get the data and then to micro-target you, because there would be a big data breach, it would be known, etc. What is more dangerous is the fact that your data, you believe, are processed in a certain way for a certain purpose, and that without knowing it, unlawfully, these data are used for another purpose, and this another purpose is to target you. And to finish, I would like to say that one of the recommendations which goes beyond data protection in this in the Commission recommendation to the member states is the fact that you can recognize, a citizen can recognize online paid political advertisement. That it is clear that when I receive an advertisement, it's coming from this party, and then you can, of course, read it the way you want, but at least you know from whom it is coming. Thank you.
Then I'll ask a follow-up question on that point, maybe both to our lawyers and regulators, and also to Sanne as a communications scientist. So you were just speaking about disclosure to the user, to the ad recipient, that they are seeing a political ad by a certain political party or group. How useful or important do you think it would be to actually disclose more information to the users about the targeting parameters? So why they are seeing this, and what, how powerful. But we still are getting a coffee break, and we can keep some coffee break time here, I believe, if we want. So how useful do you think that would be to safeguard against risks?
I think in general, transparency is very important. I mean, it's important to inform audiences why they are targeted, for instance. We also know that it also has an effect. So if you give some information about why this is targeted, you also trust the advertiser more. So this, I think, are all interesting things. The other hand, you see, if you think about transparency, there are different ways to inform voters or citizens. You can either include disclosures, or you can include, for instance, privacy statements. The problem with these statements is that they might work not so well. So people are not aware of these disclosures, don't really understand what they mean. So it's important also to, if you include more transparency and more information to voters, so also look into how you do this, like just informing them using a privacy statement, or like a very icon, which is very difficult to see for a lot of people. People see so much on websites. There are a lot of these banners. We have this blindness for these icons because we want to see the content of information, so we don't look at these little disclosures. So I think, yes, transparency is very good, but from an academic perspective, we also say, yes, but also think about how you show that to people. Are they actually effective?
Thanks. So I see a lot of people still here, despite coffee break. If there are any further questions, we can take another 2 or 3 questions. And otherwise, I would finally release you into the coffee break, and we can continue a conversation in a smaller circle. But if there's some other questions still, let's have a show of hands and ask. I see no questions, so please enjoy the coffee break.